The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the walls of St. Agnes Medical Center in Williford, Illinois. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Lila Perez gripped the edge of her hospital bed with knuckles white as snow. Sweat slicked her forehead, strands of dark hair clung to her face, and she breathed in ragged, shallow gulps. Beside her, her husband Adrian hovered helplessly, clutching her hand as though he could transfer his strength into her body. For hours, Lila had endured contractions that came like cruel waves, each one crashing over her with greater force, but she kept her jaw tight, refusing to cry out. Outside, a late autumn wind battered the window panes, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a long, cold night. Nurses bustled in and out of the room in quick, distracted bursts, their eyes tired, their words clipped. Still, Lila kept her focus on the single thought that anchored her through the pain. Soon, she would hold her son. It was just after midnight when the doctor finally appeared. His eyes bleary behind his glasses, the smell of stale coffee lingering on his coat. "All right, Mrs. Perez," he muttered, barely looking at her. "We're ready when you are. Let's get this done." Lila nodded, too exhausted to notice the impatience in his tone. Two nurses, both young, both clearly overwhelmed, moved into place, preparing the delivery table as the doctor pulled on his gloves. Adrian kissed her temple, whispering that he loved her, and she tried to smile through her exhaustion. The contractions intensified, her body instinctively taking over as she pushed, each effort punctuated by the doctor's curt commands. In her haze of pain, she barely registered the thin layer of panic that began to settle in the room as one nurse fumbled with a pair of clamps and the other's hands trembled. But she pushed on, and then, finally, there he was, a tiny, perfect boy, slick and red and wailing into the sterile air. "You did it?" Adrian whispered, his voice cracking, but Lila barely heard him over the sound of her baby's first cry. Relief flooded her body, mingled with tears of sheer gratitude. In the flurry of movement that followed, Lila caught only fragments. The nurse's hands, the doctor snapping at someone to hurry, Adrian's nervous laughter. But it all seemed to fade into a strange, unreal quiet. She watched as the nurse, a petite woman with tired eyes, lifted her son from the table to move him to the warming unit. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then it happened. The nurse's foot snagged on a stool. Her arms jerked. The baby slipped. Time seemed to splinter as he tumbled from her hands and struck the hard tile floor with a sound that would never leave Lila's memory. A sharp gasp ripped through the room as everyone froze. The nurse stood paralyzed, her face drained of color, her hands hovering in midair. For a moment, just a moment, Lila believed she'd imagined it. But then the silence was broken by Adrian's strangled cry. "No! Oh my God, no!" Chaos erupted. The nurse dropped to her knees, scooping the baby up as the doctor barked for help. Another nurse sprinted out of the room, shouting something Lila couldn't hear. Her vision tunneled, her ears ringing, her body unable to move. Adrian stood rigid, his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. In the corner of the room, the doctor and nurse huddled over the baby on the warming unit, their hands frantic, their voices low and urgent. Lila tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. The sound of monitors beeping, shoes squeaking against the floor, and muffled cries filled the air. Through it all, her son lay motionless, a fragile thing surrounded by towering adults whose faces betrayed more panic than control. One nurse glanced at Lila and shook her head almost imperceptibly before looking away. That was when Lila's stomach dropped into nothingness. They took him away without explanation, promising to do everything they could. The room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest like a weight. Lila sat in the bed, staring at her empty arms, her body still aching from delivery but her mind numb. Adrian sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, his hands pressed to his face. Neither spoke. Outside the window, dawn broke slowly, streaks of gray and pink bleeding into the horizon. But inside, time stood still. A nurse entered once to clean the room, avoiding their eyes, murmuring that the doctor would update them soon. Soon never came. Minutes became hours, and still no one returned. Lila thought about the thud she'd heard, the way it echoed in her chest, and she wondered if she would ever stop hearing it. It was late morning when the doctor finally came back. His white coat was wrinkled, his glasses smudged. He didn't look at them as he spoke. "We're very sorry," he began, his voice flat. "Your son sustained severe head trauma from the fall. Despite our efforts, we were unable to revive him. He passed about an hour ago." The words settled over the room like a shroud. Lila felt her breath catch in her throat, her body rigid. Adrian stared at the floor, shaking his head, as though refusing to let the words enter his mind. The doctor mumbled something about deepest condolences and paperwork before slipping out the door, leaving them in silence. Lila pressed her palms to her face and sobbed quietly, her whole body trembling. Adrian moved to her side, his arms wrapping around her even as his own shoulders shook. Together, they grieved the future that had been stolen from them. In the days that followed, the hospital issued a statement. "We deeply regret the tragic accident that occurred in our facility. We have identified lapses in staffing and procedure that contributed to this incident. We accept full responsibility." The words felt hollow, printed on a sheet of paper and handed to them by a grim-faced administrator. Lila sat through interviews with risk managers, lawyers, and patient advocates, each more perfunctory than the last. She learned that the nurse who dropped her baby had been covering 2 delivery rooms at once. She learned that the hospital was operating on a skeleton staff that night due to budget cuts. She learned that the warming unit hadn't been properly secured, forcing the nurse to carry the baby herself instead of using standard protocol. None of it mattered. None of it would bring him back. The funeral was small. Family gathered under a gray sky in the cold November air as they lowered a tiny white casket into the ground. Lila felt like a ghost of herself, standing there in a black dress that hung too loose on her. Adrian held her hand, but he was distant, his eyes empty. They didn't speak much anymore. At night, she would lie awake and listen to him crying in the other room. In quiet moments, she would press her hand to her belly and imagine what it would have felt like to hold her son again, just once more. His name was Matteo. She would whisper it into the silence, over and over, as though the sound of it might keep him alive somewhere. Months later, they filed a lawsuit against the hospital. Their lawyer spoke of negligence, improper staffing, and failure to follow established safety protocols. In court, Lila listened to the hospital's lawyers argue that the nurse was overworked, undertrained, and made a mistake under pressure. She watched the nurse take the stand, her hands trembling, tears streaking her face as she apologized. Lila believed her, but she also believed that the system had failed them both. The jury ruled in their favor, awarding them a settlement that felt meaningless in the face of what they'd lost. Money couldn't buy back a heartbeat. Money couldn't erase the sound of his fall. The story of Matteo reminds us how fragile life truly is, and how even a single careless moment can leave permanent scars. In healthcare, where each decision can mean life or death, there is no room for complacency. Understaffing, exhaustion, and procedural shortcuts may seem minor in the moment, but they carry devastating consequences for real people with real families. Every life matters, no matter how small, no matter how brief. This tragedy teaches us to demand accountability from the systems meant to protect us, and to advocate for ourselves, our loved ones, and others when we see risk or neglect. Because sometimes just paying attention, just slowing down, can save a life. Subscribe to the White Coat Crimes for more shocking true stories, medical crimes, medical mysteries, and the dark side of healthcare you were never meant to see.